Welcome. Today it's our great honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to invite Professor Dr. Unger to give his lecture here. And his lecture is entitled Creating Alternatives, China, Brazil, and a New Path for National Development, which also reminded me of more than 20 years ago. I guess it's in 1993 or 1994. I read two articles. The first time I know about the Professor Unger was two essays published in the 21st century, the journal called Published in Hong Kong. The first essay entitled Institutional Innovation, and the second, the Thought Liberation. They call for the thought liberation or the second enlightenment. In that essay, the author reminded us maybe we need to rethink ourselves. And after the first thought liberation movement from the end of the 1970s down to the 1980s, and in which he actually lists several crucial, the key theories as his resources. One I still remember, if I'm right, one is a new theory of evolution. Second is analytical Marxism. Last one, and for me it's the most important one, because at that time we are talking about the property rights reform. He actually tried to use the theory of the critical legal studies, in which he talked about the theory about the Robert Unger. So that's the first time I know the name. And again, not so, maybe almost same time, I read another essay which talked about how to interpret the Chinese reform with the reference to comparative vision about the Russia's reform. So it's a comparative, the models between Russia, Gorbachev, Yeltsin's reform, and China's reform. We know that after the 1989, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European systems, that the most of people, both inside of China and also in other places in the West, they all highly praise the shock therapy model that the Gorbachev and Yeltsin, especially Yeltsin's model for Russia and for the transition. And most of the observers downplay the importance of what China had achieved since the end of the Cultural Revolution. So how to evaluate the China's role and the Chinese the reform is a big issue. That two essays, I think it's a stirred the first round of the debates after the 1989 among Chinese intellectuals. At that time, I think the majority of the Chinese intellectuals were very critical to that views, to that comparative vision. This is an intellectual minority. So sometimes intellectual minority is important, has been very important. Different voices, new thinkings, much more than the mainstream thinking sometimes. Looks in the marginal, but from long term, we can prove the historical experience. We talk about the practice, prove that maybe the views held by those minorities were maybe even more important. In this case, I think it's true. It's true. Last more than 20 years, that the views, analysis, and the methodological views on the comparison between Russia and China and the whole the post end of the Cold War transformation in the world, I think it's more positive for me. And so in that case, though even I don't know when was the first time Professor Unger visited China, but in any case, where that others, the introduction and the use of that application of that theory into the analysis about China's reality and at that time the global developments. The Professor Robert Unger already has become the insider of the Chinese debates. So your theory and the discussion and the views already become the insider views from China too. So that's, I think, today I would like to mention these because the order of these two essays also sit here. That's Professor Cui Zhiyuan is our leading political scientist at the Tsinghua University, also the professor at our Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Studies. So he will, after the lecture, he will give some comments and to be the discussion for this session. And I know that the full of the audience is not necessary for me to introduce too much about the Professor Unger, but I just mentioned several things. One is that he is the Pound Jurisprudence, the chair professor at the Harvard University. So that's the very distinguished position here. And also he was actually in the 1970s, 80s, he launched the certain kind of the moment, like intellectual moments for the critical legal studies, has become the crucial figure in that thinking. And a very important change, that's through this campaign, there was a certain kind of the change in the whole atmosphere of the legal studies in the North America, I think. And another issue is that he's not only an intellectual and a professor in the classroom, in the reading room, but also he's also the politician and activist. He was appointed twice to be the minister, Brazilian minister of the strategic affairs. So that's he directly involved in the Brazil politics and used that position to work with many, not only inside of Brazil, but also came to China and work with Dai Bingguai and those political figures in China too. So that's the very important position. He had, if you check the website, you will find that he's the coverage of the whole fields, different legal studies, philosophy, social theory, economics, and so on and so forth, different, and even cosmology, to talk about these different kind of huge publications. And I would like to suggest that now, after the more than 20, I think 23, 24 years ago, Professor Cui Zhiyuan's introduction, now we at least have 7 books by Professor Unger has been translated into Chinese. So you can find it from the bookstores and to buy them and to read them. So that's, I think, that give us a great opportunity to learn, to study his theory. And here, today, we will welcome Professor Unger to give us this is a second lecture, as I should. His first lecture was yesterday afternoon, which held in the Central Party School. And also the evening, he was interviewed in CGTN, right? That the CCTV English channels, it's a long interview. So maybe today we'll rebroadcast it. Afterwards, you can check that from the websites. So now we welcome the Professor Unger to give the lecture.
My theme is the next step in national development around the world, but especially having in mind the experiences of Brazil, of China, and of the United States as well. I organized my argument this afternoon around 2 central ideas. The first idea is the idea of the primacy of structural change. We cannot organize national development today without reorganizing the economy, without giving a new institutional form to the market economy. Many of the experiments in national development in the recent historical period have addressed mainly the demand side of the economy, democratizing the demand side, creating a market in mass consumption. Now there can be no progress in national development without the reorganization of the economy on the supply side. On the demand side, we can often hope to progress simply by redirecting resources and using money. But on the supply side, no progress is possible without institutional innovation. What matters most is structural change. Change in the institutions that define the market economy. The market economy has no single natural and necessary form. The tendency of the economist, working within the main line of economic theory, is still to believe that a market is a market, contract is contract, and property is property. But 150 years of legal analysis have demonstrated that the market economy has no predetermined institutional and legal form. Now, we find ourselves, with respect to the idea of structural change, in a unique and unprecedented position. Like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we understand that what matters most, ultimately, is structural change. Change in the institutional arrangements. First of the economy, and then of the state, of politics. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we are no longer willing to trust our future to a definitive and dogmatic institutional blueprint. Our problem is therefore this, that we must imagine and implement structural change without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. A consequence of this problem is that one of the most important attributes of any set of institutional arrangements that we develop is that they lend themselves to correction in the light of experience. They must somehow organize their own revision, given that we cannot entrust ourselves to any single, definitive, and exclusive institutional blueprint. The second idea around which I organize my argument is that all thinking about national development today, in the circumstances of our countries, must begin by addressing a particular dilemma. Here is a simple presentation of that dilemma. The teaching of classical development economics, the development economics that was produced in the second half of the 20th century, is that the crucial element in the promotion of national development is the transfer of workers and resources from the less productive to the more productive sectors of the economy. Meaning, in practice, their transfer from agriculture to industry. Industry as conventional industrialization, what we call Fordist mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services with rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and highly hierarchical and specialized work relations. Now, it's true that in the doctrine of classical development economics, there was also a genuflection to the so-called fundamentals, institutions and education. But what development economics had to say about institutions and education was very little. The institutional framework of development was supposed to be a regulated market economy that allowed a large space for the market economy in its conventional form, but also reserved authority to the state and a planning apparatus in the state that would give a platform to the development economists themselves. Lip service was paid to education, but the truth is that conventional Fordist mass production requires very little by way of education of its workers. The worker needed to have only three things. First, a disposition to obey, discipline. Second, elementary literacy and numeracy, the ability to read and understand simple instructions. And third, physical dexterity, such as hand-eye coordination. Nothing more was or is necessary in a Fordist mass production factory. The whole weight of development therefore fell on the operation of transferring workers and resources from the less productive to the more productive sectors. Now it turns out that this route to economic growth is compromised or blocked for several reasons. First, it is no longer the road to the highest position in the world division of labor. It is no longer the route to the highest position because a new, most advanced form of production has emerged. Knowledge-intensive, advanced manufacturing. Radically flexible, experimentalist, and innovative. That is now the summit of the economic hierarchy. The second reason why this route to economic growth is blocked is that increasingly the new most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy, is capable of outcompeting conventional industrialization, of producing the same goods and services better at lower cost. The third reason is that in the now subaltern realm of conventional industrialization, there is a pernicious competition among economies for the lowest returns to labor and the lowest taxes. A worldwide labor and tax arbitrage. And the fourth reason is that in the light of the emergence of the new most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy, the very distinction among sectors of the economy, which was the premise of the message of conventional development economics, ceases to hold. The distinction among sectors is increasingly attenuated. For example, advanced manufacturing can be understood as crystallized intellectual services. There is no clear distinction between industry and services under this new paradigm of production. So that's the first horn of the dilemma. Conventional industrialization is no longer a reliable route to national development. The second horn of the dilemma is that the apparent alternative, which is the dissemination of the knowledge economy, seems to be inaccessible as a solution for the developing countries. Knowledge-intensive production exists in the major economies of the world only in the form of insular vanguards that exclude the vast majority of the labor force in each country. These insular vanguards are established now in every sector of the economy, not simply in manufacturing as advanced knowledge-intensive manufacturing, but also in services, knowledge-intensive services, and even in agriculture, precision scientific agriculture. But in every sector of the economy, the advanced practice of production remains a fringe under the control of a technological and entrepreneurial elite. The mega firms that command the knowledge economy find ways to commoditize or routinize parts of their business and then assign these commoditized parts of production to other firms spread around the world. So then this belated Fordist mass production becomes the partner of the hyper-insular form of the knowledge economy, controlled by a tiny number of people and businesses. Now, what would we need? We would need to establish an inclusive vanguardism, a form of the knowledge economy that is widely disseminated throughout the entire production system, to open the gateways of access to the knowledge economy to the majority of the labor force. So long as the knowledge economy continues to exist, only in its present confined form, under quarantine in these insular vanguards, there will be a cause for both economic stagnation and massive economic inequality. In the United States now, there is a discourse of secular stagnation. that attempts to make economic slowdown, the slowing of rise of productivity, appear to be natural, and attributes it to causes such as the supposedly lower potential of contemporary technologies when compared to the technological innovations of 100 years ago. But the truth is that the fundamental cause of economic stagnation today in the most advanced economies is the restriction of the most advanced practice of production to these narrow vanguards excluding the majority of the labor force. The practice of production that would make labor more productive is denied to the vast majority of workers and of firms. That's the basic cause of economic stagnation. And as it is a cause of economic stagnation, it is also a cause of economic inequality. The hierarchical segmentation of the economy, the structural division between the vanguards and the rear guard of declining mass production industry and the rear guard of technologically and organizationally backward small business becomes the cause of massive inequality. Inequality rooted in the structural divisions of the economy cannot be effectively overcome by the traditional devices for the moderation of inequality, which are the defense of small business against big business and the appeal to compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and by redistributive social spending. What we would need, therefore, would be an inclusive and radicalized form of the knowledge economy. It exists nowhere in the world today. To bring it about, we would have to innovate radically in the institutions that define the market economy. Now, here then is the problem for the developing countries. The route to economic growth through conventional industrialization no longer seems to be reliable. But the alternative, which would be an inclusive form of the now most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy, seems to be inaccessible. If it does not exist, even in the richest economies of the world, with the most educated populations, and the most refined institutional capabilities, how can we expect to create it under the conditions of a developing economy? That's the dilemma. My thesis is that this dilemma can be resolved only by breaking it on the second side. That is to say, by finding a way to make the seemingly inaccessible task of inaugurating an inclusive form of economic vanguardism accessible. To make it accessible by breaking it up into pieces or parts or steps so that we can get there from here. Those are my two central ideas. And I propose now to develop those ideas in two steps. The first step is to begin by considering these problems in a global context, in relation to the dramatic imbalances in the world economy. And the second step is to define in broad outline the elements of a progressive political economy in developing countries like China and Brazil. To suggest, at least in summary form, a doctrine, an institutional doctrine of the alternative form of national development today. So first, the problem considered in the context of the world economy and of these global imbalances among the large economies of the world. Let's begin with the United States. In the closing decades of the 20th century, economic growth in the United States came to be based in large part on the creation of a market in mass consumption. But we also know that in this same historical period, there was in the United States a dramatic regressive redistribution of income and wealth, a dramatic increase in inequality. Now, how could the Americans reconcile mass consumption with regressive redistribution? Part of the answer is that a property-owning democracy was replaced by a fake credit democracy. Mass consumption was reconciled with regressive redistribution through an appeal to credit and to debt. Made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral, especially in the years that preceded the crisis that went from 2007 to 2009. The United States in this historical period has had no strategy of economic growth other than the policy of easy money, of expansionary monetary policy conducted by the central bank, the Federal Reserve, rather than by the central government. And this approach to economic growth through easy money, debt, and credit, has in turn been facilitated by the relation that existed between the Chinese and the American economies in the period before that crisis. The counterpart to the American capital and trade deficits were the Chinese trade and capital surpluses. The Americans used these imbalances in the world economy as a way to evade the task of structural change within the United States. Instead of developing a new productivist project, instead of democratizing the American economy on the supply side, after having democratized it on the demand side, they organized a strategy of economic growth based on debt, credit, easy money, and global imbalances. Now consider Brazil. In the recent historical period, the dominant strategy of economic growth in Brazil had two bases. The first basis was again the democratization of the economy on the demand side. Mass consumption, made possible by an increase in the returns to labor and by social transfers. And the second foundation of this strategy of economic growth was the production and export of commodities. Agriculture, ranching, and mining paid the bill of urban consumption. And Brazil underwent a process of premature deindustrialization. The profile of its production and exports regressed, and this regression is mirrored in the structure of its trade with China. Now, what would be necessary? What would be necessary would be now to democratize the Brazilian economy on the supply side. By an institutional broadening of access to economic and educational opportunities and capabilities. There is a fundamental asymmetry between democratizing the economy on the demand side and democratizing it on the supply side. Democratization on the demand side can be achieved just with money. But democratization on the supply side, on the demand side, just with money, but democratization on the supply side requires structural change, that is to say, institutional innovation. Now, there were two ways in Brazil of avoiding or postponing the task of structural innovation on the supply side. The first way, ephemeral, was the appeal to vulgar Keynesianism. When the commodity prices collapsed, the government attempted to extend the afterlife of the failed strategy of economic growth by deficit spending. And in this way, it artificially extended the life of that approach, but progressively disorganized public finance, aggravating the subsequent crisis. And the second way to avoid the task of structural change, which has proved to be more lasting, has been to exploit the structural imbalances in the world economy as an instrument for the evasion of structural change. And the primary context for that evasion has been the relation between the Brazilian and the Chinese economies. So long as Brazil could export these untransformed natural products to China and sustain itself by that means, it could find an easy way out without having to engage the task of structural change. Now we come to China to complete this triangle. The Chinese strategy of economic growth in the recent historical period has been belated Fordist mass production, oriented to export. Rather than the deepening of the internal market in China. Now, the deepening of the internal market in China is not a task that can be accomplished by a simple technocratic redirection of resources. It requires massive redistribution among sectors, among regions, and among classes within the country. It is inherently conflictual. There is no ready-made formula to which it can conform. It has to be thought out and organized. It therefore requires a dialectic of ideas and of forces, which the country in its present form is unable to accommodate. Instead of facing the internal task of structural change, China evaded that task by using these structural imbalances in the world economy, expressed on the one hand in its relation to the United States, to which it exported its capital and trade surpluses, and on the other hand in its relation to Brazil and other countries, from which it received the untransformed natural resources, the commodities. China would now have to pass from being a low-wage, low-productivity economy to becoming a high-wage, high-productivity economy. It too would have to reorganize economic life on the supply side. And it would have to find a way to do what no country in the world has yet done, which is to establish the knowledge economy in a socially inclusive form, to disseminate the now most advanced practice of production throughout the economy, rather than to leave it quarantined in the insular vanguards. So we see that in each of these three instances, the imbalances in the world economy have been used by the elites governing these countries as a way to evade the work of structural change. Now, the counterpart to this evasion is a certain attitude to the now dominant form of globalization. Instead of challenging the established world order, and in particular the established world economic order, and within the economic order the trade regime, China, Brazil, and the other major developing countries have simply sought to achieve a more favorable position within the existing order. They have failed to exercise their vocation as emerging powers of being revisionary, of demanding and achieving a revision of the established order. Consider the example of the World Trade Regime, one of the many dimensions of that order. The World Trade Regime under the aegis of the WTO treaties and of the major regional trade pacts, is being organized under a principle that you could describe as institutional maximalism. To participate in the present regime of world trade, a country must not only subscribe to the market economy in the abstract, it must accept a very particular version of the market economy. It is a version of the market economy that prohibits, under the label subsidies, all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms that the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich. It is also a version of the market economy that leaves the most important technological innovations in the control of a handful of multinational businesses under the odious regime of intellectual property that was developed at the end of the 19th century. What these emerging countries should demand in the exercise of their revisionary vocation is that an open world economy be organized on the basis of an institutional minimalism. That is to say, the maximum of openness with the minimum of restraint on the institutional experiments that are needed to organize national development, and in particular that are needed to advance the project that I called inclusive vanguardism, the inclusive form of a knowledge economy. Engagement in the world economy should cease to be a way of evading the task of structural change. And all the emerging powers should work together toward a revision of the basis of the world order, and in particular the basis of world trade. The goal for which they should work together is to achieve freedom, to develop the institutional experiments that the national development alternatives require. I now go on to the second part of my argument. I considered the task of developing the alternative in the world context. Now I want to consider it in its primary domestic context, and to outline the axes of a progressive political economy within each of these countries. Now, in thinking in this way, I have in mind the Brazilian and the Chinese examples, but I do not believe myself to be proposing a set of idiosyncratic national solutions. These are alternatives that would take distinct form in each country, but would nevertheless have relevance for the whole of humanity. There's a strange situation in the ideological debate in the world today. The orthodoxy that sometimes goes under the name of neoliberalism, humanized or not by institutionally conservative social democracy, is a universal orthodoxy. It's an orthodoxy that claims to be applicable to every country in the world. But the heresies are local. And the general position of the progressives is to develop these national heresies by combining elements of the universal orthodoxy with particular adaptations in each national context. The truth is that a universal orthodoxy can be successfully combated only by a universalizing heresy, as liberalism and socialism were in the 19th century. And it is therefore in that spirit of a universalizing heresy that I make these remarks about the main lines of an alternative political economy. Now let me distinguish three axes of such an alternative. An alternative that would take distinct form in each country, but that would nevertheless be a universalizing rather than a merely local heresy. The first axis is the properly economic one. And it in turn has three main elements. The first element is the organization of what I called inclusive vanguardism. Finding a way to advance the knowledge economy, post-Fordist, knowledge-intensive production in inclusive rather than in insular form. To do that, we have to innovate in the institutional and legal architecture of the market economy. And we can imagine such an innovation as proceeding in steps. At a first step, the task is simply to extend access to credit, to technology, to advanced practice and knowledge, to a wider range of small and medium-sized firms. To coordinate or to orchestrate this access, to identify what works, and to disseminate the successful experiments throughout the economy. In the second step of this institutional and legal evolution, we would begin explicitly to change the legal architecture of the market economy in two dimensions: in the relation between government and firms, and in the relation among firms. With respect to the relation between governments and firms, there are now in the world two main models of government-business dealings. There's the American model of the arm's-length regulation of business by government, and there's the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. We would have to imagine a third option, a form of strategic coordination between governments and firms that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimentalist, and that has as its goal the wider dissemination in the economy of the most advanced practice of production. And in the relation among firms, especially small and medium-sized innovative firms, to develop the practice of cooperative competition so that these firms could, while competing against one another, cooperate, pool resources, and by pooling them, achieve economies of scale. Then we would come to a third and more radical stage of institutional evolution, in which we begin to diversify the basic ways in which there can be access to the resources and opportunities of production, the regimes of property and of contract. Why should the market economy be fastened to a single version of itself? Economic decentralization can be organized in very different ways. Each of them serves a different purpose and works best in a different context. In a radically experimentalist and democratized market economy, different regimes of property and contract, that is, different ways of organizing economic decentralization, should be able to coexist experimentally. That's the only way in which, over time, we can hope to achieve a disseminated and radicalized form of the knowledge economy. The second element in this economic project has to do with the relation between capital and labor. It is impossible to promote such an economic alternative on the basis of cheap, disorganized, and unqualified work. Radical innovation requires an upward tilt to the returns to labor. Now, so long as Fordist mass production was the dominant form of production, workers could be assembled in large productive units under the aegis of large firms. That was the basic of the classical representation and protection of labor. But remember that this way of organizing labor was ascendant only in a relatively brief historical period, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. It was preceded by several centuries in which work was organized on the basis of decentralized contractual arrangements, like the putting out system described by Marx in the early chapters of Capital. Now we have in the world a new putting out system. Once again, labor is being organized on the basis of decentralized contractual arrangements, now on a global basis. Hundreds of millions of people are condemned to precarious employment. The progressives, the advocates of this development alternative that I'm outlining, have to have a project for changing the relation of labor to capital and rescuing this mass of workers from the circumstance of precarious employment and radical economic insecurity. I'll give you an example of two principles that would characterize such an alternative. The first principle would be a kind of sliding scale. The precarious workers should be organized and represented. And to the extent that they are not organized and represented, there has to be direct legal protection. The more they are organized and represented, the less the need for direct legal protection, And inversely, the less they are organized and represented, the greater the need. And then comes the second principle, defining the content of the legal protection. The first rule in this legal protection would be the price neutrality of labor. Labor provided in temporary or subcontracted or precarious form has to be paid the same amount for the analogous labor undertaken under stable employment. Flexibility cannot serve as an excuse for the degradation of work. And all of that requires a new set of legal ideas intervening in the relation between capital and labor. Now we come to the third element in this economic project, which is the relation of finance to the real economy. Finance can be a good servant, but it is always a bad master. Under the current form of the market economy, in all the major economies of the world, there is an enigma about the role of finance. We know that overwhelmingly production is self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. The vast majority of the funding of production is generated within the production system itself. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? Theoretically, it's to finance the productive agenda of society. In fact, the vast preponderance of private liquid capital has only an oblique or episodic relation to the funding of productive activity. Finance is largely irrelevant to production in good times and becomes destructive in bad times. The source of instability, of crisis, damaging real economic activity. The only way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. That means to enlist it in the service of production in the real economy. By innovations that have both a negative and a positive form. The negative form is to discourage or prohibit all varieties of financial activity that have no plausible relation to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity. And the positive form is to develop new ways to tap the productive potential of finance. For example, by mimicking through governmental initiatives the undone work of private venture capital, which under the present arrangements of the market economy is a minuscule proportion of total financial activity. Now I have outlined the content of the economic part of this alternative. Inclusive vanguardism, the disseminated and radicalized form of the knowledge economy, the reorganization of the relation between labor and capital, and the reshaping of the relation between finance and the real economy. This economic project would have to be sustained by two other large projects. One of them about education, and the other about democracy and politics. A disseminated and radicalized knowledge economy requires a kind of education different from the one that now prevails in the world. It must be, first, an education that accords priority to analytic and synthetic capabilities, the powers of the imagination, over passive information and memory. Second, because these capabilities cannot be acquired in a vacuum of content, it must prefer selective deepening to encyclopedic coverage and superficiality. Third, it must be organized on the basis of cooperative teaching and learning among students and among teachers. And fourth, and most significantly, it must be dialectical in its relation to the received body of knowledge. Every subject must be taught at least twice from two contrasting points of view. That is the only way to liberate the mind. This model of education applies to technical education just as much as it applies to general education. It requires a form of technical education that focuses on generic, higher order, practical and conceptual capabilities, like the capabilities needed for the use of numerically controlled machine tools, rather than on job-specific and machine-specific skills, or on the traditional rigid professions and trades. The third large project is a project about politics and democracy. These alternatives can advance and flourish only against the background of a political life that is capable of mastering the established structure of society. The fundamental basis of democratic politics is epistemological. We need to master the structure and to change the structure. Otherwise, the structure becomes our fate. But there is no dogmatic formula or blueprint in which we can trust. We must be able to experiment and to organize our experiments over time. We must be able to establish institutions that lend themselves to correction, that organize their own correction in the light of experience. All the democracies that exist in the world today are weak democracies. They are democracies that are not able to confront the structure of society except in circumstances of crisis. Crisis as economic collapse or as military conflict. They make change depend on crisis. And they therefore perpetuate the rule of the living by the dead. We need high-energy democracies. A high-energy democracy has the following four attributes. First, it organizes a permanent pluralism of forces in tension with each other. It understands conflict to be a mechanism of social union rather than of social disintegration. Second, it creates mechanism for the rapid resolution of impasse so that there can be strong central initiative. For example, through anticipated elections or comprehensive programmatic plebiscites and referenda. Third, it combines strong central initiative with the ability of society to allow particular parts of the country to secede from the general national solution and to create counter-models of the national future. There is no contradiction between strong central initiative and radical devolution. The two can be deepened at the same time. And fourth, it requires an organized heightening of the level of popular engagement in political life, a high-temperature politics. So we hasten the pace and we raise the temperature. Only a mobilized politics can be rich in structural content. The particular institutional forms of a high-energy politics will be different in each society according to its circumstance and its history. But this idea of the vocation of democracy puts us on a direction different from the direction of the weak democracies that exist today. Now I ask the question, is there in our countries a real social basis, a constituency for an alternative like the one that I have just outlined? And I claim that there is. This alternative basis can be described in three partly equivalent forms. The first form has to do with the aspirations and interests of the working class majority of these societies. What do they want? They want a modicum of prosperity and independence. Their fundamental attitude by default is petty bourgeois more than it is proletarian. In the absence of other alternatives, their ideal is a traditional, isolated family business or a smallholder. In modern European history, the left calamitously